So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about those women who are employed. We know that about a third of all women into and through the 1950s work in domestic service, broadly defined, and that the majority of those, not the majority, but proportionally a greater number of those women are African American women and recent immigrants. Do those women have any sense of community? Are they able to improve their conditions, or are their conditions the same in the 50s and 60s as they were earlier?
Domestic work is a very atomized occupation. So domestic workers are employed in a single household. They usually don't have a lot of contact with other domestic workers. So it's a very difficult occupation for people to actually develop any kind of collective identity, even though in the public discourse we know the figure of the mammy, who is a content and a loyal African American woman who serves a white family. The figure of the mammy plays a prominent role in public and political discourse. It's a stereotype. African American women are not actually content household workers. They're not content being employed in the kitchens of white families. But in the 1950s and in the 1960s, African American women begin to develop a social movement to transform the occupation of domestic work. The Montgomery Bus Boycott is perhaps one excellent example of that. The vast majority of participants in the boycott were African American domestic workers. They were the ones who rode the buses to and from work every day. And the buses actually become an important site of organizing for domestic workers. They're unlike other workers because they don't have a collective space where they're employed. So the public spaces, the playgrounds, and the buses become their sites of organizing. So I think it's important to think about the ways in which domestic workers actually can reframe our understanding and our thinking of labor organizing as not always taking place on the shop floor. But the process of organizing, which begins in the buses and extends outwards to communities, becomes a way that African American women begin to challenge the racial inequality that defines their everyday lives. In the Montgomery Bus Boycott, there was a woman named Georgia Gilmore, who was a domestic worker who began to organize other domestic workers. And she formed something called the Club from Nowhere. And this was a group of domestic workers who wanted to remain anonymous, but who baked pies and cakes and made chicken dinners and sold these in their neighborhoods, in their communities, as a way to raise money for the boycott. And Georgia Gilmore went to the mass meetings on Monday nights and Thursday nights and donated the hundreds of dollars the domestic workers had gathered. And as you can imagine, the church in Montgomery where they met just burst into loud applause and cheers as the domestic workers handed their money over. Georgia Gilmore was eventually fired from her job because of her support of the Montgomery Bus Boycott, and Martin Luther King helped her open up a restaurant out of her own living room, her own kitchen, and it became a meeting ground for civil rights activists where King would actually go to have his meetings when he wanted to ensure that he had a secure space.
And is this the beginning of a domestic workers' union of some kind?
Georgia Gilmore was not involved in a domestic worker union, but I think her story is an important one for illustrating the ways in which domestic workers were able to mobilize and organize. There was another woman in Atlanta, Dorothy Bolden, who actually watched news programs about the Montgomery Bus Boycott. And Dorothy Bolden in Atlanta became inspired by what she saw happening in Montgomery. And she started an organization in Atlanta that she called the National Domestic Workers Union of America. Dorothy Bolden organized on the buses in Atlanta, and she started a hiring center where she would screen both employers and employees. She established a basic minimum wage for the day.
Is this in the 50s?
This is in 1968.
1968.
Yes,
So
yes.
the civil rights movement was already well underway.
The civil rights movement was well underway, although Dorothy Bolden actually was involved in a number of issues prior to domestic worker organizing. So she was involved in the struggle to desegregate schools in Atlanta throughout the early 1960s. She worked with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. By this time, King had also moved to Atlanta, so she was a friend of King's as well. And so there are multiple connections in the way in which civil rights organizing and domestic worker rights organizing evolved from the 1950s through the 1960s.
Was Dorothy Bolden supported by the organized labor movement? Did they have anything to do, or did they help her in any way?
No, there was very little support of domestic worker organizing by mainstream labor unions in the 1960s or the 1970s. It's not until the late 1970s and early 1980s that some labor unions, such as the Service Employees International Union, begins to think about ways that they can support domestic worker organizing.
So what was the impact then of domestic worker organizing?
I think domestic worker organizing was incredibly important for giving voice to a group of women that had been politically and economically marginalized. These were women, most of whom had not finished high school, who organized in their communities, but also went before Congress and testified about their work histories about why domestic workers needed labor protections. Domestic workers had been excluded from core labor laws in the 1930s. They were denied the right to Social Security, to unemployment insurance, and to minimum wage. They lobbied through the late 60s and early 70s for federal minimum wage protections. They allied with many white middle-class women, including members of the National Organization for Women. They testified before Congress. They lobbied their congresspeople, and they won. In 1974, this occupation for the first time wins federal minimum wage protections.
It came under the FLSA, the Fair Labor Standards Act.
Absolutely, yes. It was an amendment to the Fair Labor Standards Act. I think it was an enormous victory. I think it was an enormous victory because of how far they had come, because of the ways in which the racial inequality was embedded in law, which they managed to overturn. On the other hand, there were and there still are problems with enforcement of the minimum wage legislation. This is still an atomized occupation, and it's very difficult to ensure that every single employer is paying her or his employee the basic minimum wage.